Hey everyone, and welcome to our live stream talking all about improving social media, content moderation, and democracy. I'm your host for the conversation. My name is David Ryan Polgar. I am the founder and director for the organization All Tech is Human, which is committed to informing and inspiring the next generation of responsible technologists and change makers. I'm thrilled today to be sitting in conversation with Sarah T. Roberts. You might be familiar with her groundbreaking work around content moderation, even specifically about the health of content moderators, something we oftentimes forget. We'll also soon be joined with Murtaza Sheikh, who's going to be joining us any minute, and we'll just add him to the conversation. Also want to point out that this live stream is part of our regular live stream that we have with our partners, TheBridge. So check them out at thebridgework.com. In addition, we have a follow-up podcast and curated resources provided by our partners at the Radical AI podcast. So Sarah, without further ado, this is such a hot topic, especially right now with the January 6th attack on the Capitol brought into focus the role that social media may play in radicalizing individuals and leading from online conversations, which deals with moderation and use of algorithm, which showcases what information people are seeing, and offline violence, which unfortunately we saw on January 6th. So Sarah, I'd like to just hear your general thoughts about how this changed the conversation, right? This Capitol attack, and also just tell the audience tuning in a little bit more about your background, your work with the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, and also would love to hear about Behind the Screen, your book as well.
Sure, thanks. I'll try to, professors not known for their succinct responses, so I'll do my best to hit all those points. First of all, thanks for the opportunity for being here and connecting with your viewers. I'm really grateful for the conversation. We couldn't have known how timely this was going to be when you invited me on the program, but here we are. On the other side of the events of yesterday of the inauguration. So I guess, first of all, for those who don't know me, who are watching, my name is Sarah Roberts. I'm a professor at UCLA, associate professor of information studies. And I'm also the co-founder and co-director, along with my longtime collaborator and colleague, Dr. Safiya Noble, of the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, which we call C2I2. You'll never forget it if you think of R2D2. So C2I2 at UCLA, where we're working on many issues, including content moderation, bias in AI, and other issues of the day. So I think, just to cut in on the most recent events, and of course, I think what's on everyone's mind at this time is the, what felt like maybe a great exhale, like finally some action was taken on Twitter, Donald Trump's platform of choice, as well as other platforms that then responded. But Twitter, of course, being the one in the spotlight because of his proclivity to use it and one might say abuse it. What was interesting about his action taken to suspend his account was that, in my estimation, what was asked of Donald Trump at that time was that he follow the rules, the terms of engagement, which all other users must follow. And I was asked to comment on that for The Guardian, kind of like, what's my big idea going forward? And I'll just kind of paraphrase what I said there around this issue. I think there's no special AI required. There's no legion of content moderators that need to be brought on to do this particular work around Trump or other world leaders who are abusing the platform. They need to be held to the same set of rules at a baseline as others. But then the question that I really had is, why would the bar for such a powerful individual with such reach, and as we saw, the ability to go from so-called cyberspace, where we used to imagine it had no material consequences in the world, to fomenting insurrection at the U.S. Capitol building. Why would we allow such a person to have such a low bar? Perhaps the standard should be higher for such a person's behavior on an account. I mean, let's remember that these firms, there's no tablets that came down from on high where these rules were written in stone. These companies are crafting policies and implementing them often on the fly. They're dynamic. They can respond to situations as they unfold, and they ought to do that, right? They ought to have the flexibility to respond to breaking things. So why not, pivot and say, okay, the policy we had was not working. This person is poking Swiss cheese holes through our policy. We need to reorient. I applaud Twitter for taking its move, although calling it the 11th hour, I mean, let's call it what it was, 11:59 with 59 seconds. Yes, of course, we've got a user said the answer is money. The business model, right? The business model is at the root of all these decisions, and we'll get into that more later. Yeah. But I'll leave my initial comment there.
Well, Sarah, you mentioned so many aspects that we could dig in for the next 45 minutes without a problem. So I did write down a few comments. I also have a bunch of the questions that were submitted earlier when people signed up for this. So I would want to motivate anybody who is watching. We have a lot of folks tuning in right now to ask your questions in the comment section, and I'll see those and then incorporate a lot of them directly into our chat. But I want to bring on right now Murtaza Sheikh, who is joining us from London. So Murtaza, welcome to the conversation. Love to just have your take on some of the changes that have happened in recent days, specifically the Capitol attack on January 6th, and how it's changed your field of study, especially around the work that you do with the United Nations with some of the hate speech concerns that they have.
Thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me. And yes, so I advise not the UN itself, but the UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues, specifically, who is an independent expert. And I have a forthcoming publication also on the incitement to religious hatred under international law and UK law. So what happened in relation to Trump and what's being called deplatforming wasn't specifically to do with hate speech, but it was related to the idea of inciting hate, inciting violence, as it were. And for me, the situation is a lot more complex. And really, what Sarah has mentioned about a lot of these actions being reactive and taken too late, it creates further problems because what happened with regards to the storming, in my view, was the culmination of a pattern of consistent behavior that, if you wanted to put it in a very short time span, you would say began before the election, where Donald Trump had already started saying that if I win, I win. If I lose, it's rigged, which is a nonsensical position to have. But that's a difficult thing to moderate. But as soon as the elections took place, and at that point, the lie, or alternative reality that was promoted on all social media platforms, that is what culminated in the storming of the Capitol. And if we were to take the exact words that were used right at the end to ban him or to suspend him, it may be difficult to show that those words themselves were incitements to violence. And we'll see that when I think there's a case in a state in the US that is trying to take it forward. In just about 20 minutes ago, Facebook has announced that through Nick Clegg, that Facebook itself has referred the case to the Oversight Board. And we'll see how the Oversight Board deals with it. And it will be very embarrassing, in fact, if Oversight Board comes back and says, well, according to your own policies, you shouldn't have suspended him and you have to let him back on. So these are very difficult things that we have to deal with. And I would say the thing that is an umbrella or that covers all of these things is what is the impact and the role of the content policies that these platforms say that they have? What guarantees do we have that they're being implemented? Do we know that they're being implemented consistently? And before we start talking about oversight mechanisms and regulatory mechanisms, and legislating to limit their power and so on, the starting point is implement your own content policies and show the world that you are doing it. And the way you do that is you do what you've done with Trump right now, but you do it with a lot of other cases. So, for example, with Trump, they had to come up with rationales for which policy they used, why it applied to him, and why it resulted in suspension. Now, that sort of reasoning that you would find in, for example, a legal decision is completely absent until now. It just doesn't exist. We have transparency reports, which are a great step forward, but they need to be disaggregated a whole lot more. The appeals processes aren't really robust. Having an oversight board, it doesn't deal with every appeal.
Okay.
It's a Supreme Court that deals with cases that are going to set precedents in terms of content policies.
Oh, right. I mean, if we look at the Facebook Oversight Board, which interestingly enough also incentivized the creation of the real Facebook Oversight Board, which is critical, I guess, of some of the ways that they go about making these decisions. So certainly a lot happening in this area. But I want to bring back to what Sarah was saying earlier about platforms like Twitter making these rules and then trying to enforce them. When we think about this, especially since there's a lot of lawyers involved in creating these content moderation policies through the community guidelines and terms of service, which we kind of contractually agree to when we're using the platform. When we think about it, we tend to think of it, especially in an American sense, from more of a free expression. And when you deal with statutes on free speech, we generally like to apply whether or not this is arbitrary and capricious in terms of how a rule was enforced or not enforced. Where it gets interesting, though, is Twitter is a private company, and so is Facebook and other social media platforms. So First Amendment comes up a lot, but interestingly enough, it's Twitter that has a First Amendment right, and not necessarily the users. So Sarah, I'd like to have you kind of maybe expand on that or your own kind of opinion, because you heard Donald Trump and others talk about their First Amendment being offended. Whereas if you go back and read your copy of the Constitution, which is a good time to get your pocket Constitution right now, since we have democracy in peril in 2021, you go back and look at the First Amendment. It deals with what Congress, right, what the government cannot infringe on. So Sarah, I'd love to hear your take on this.
Well, I mean, this is a central issue at play here. And I think we have to acknowledge several threads in what you said. First of all, we have a situation now where we have private companies who declined originally to be in the business, so they said, of the moderation of the content which they carried, and they were legally, by American statute, allowed to take that position. Now fully in the business of dealing with content full time, all the time, that now has gone one step further and has invented its own judiciary. So we're seeing this quasi state apparatus kind of developing within these companies, which signals their profound power globally. Mm-hmm. And now we've taken American jurisprudence, American norms, American sensibilities, and American kind of legal traditions and interpretations, and they are being sort of applied carte blanche around the world in ways that don't fit, in ways that might actually contradict other norms and processes and expectations and laws in other parts of the world, which have their own sovereign rights. And so now we've set up quite a significant soft power kind of struggle through this through this kind of packaging up of these not just American norms, but I would say specifically as interpreted by the business interests of Silicon Valley. So, for all the talk about free speech and its as a fundamental organizing principle of social media, your viewers might ask themselves why they find their experience of social media to be something other than their own free expression, that it seems to be supporting the free expression of others at their peril. So I would hold that out and put a pin in that. I would say the corollary here that I think it's important to introduce are the organizing logic around the whole apparatus of what I call commercial content moderation, which is kind of the at-scale industrial practice of content moderation that we see these platforms undertake. Is that, and this is a central thesis of the book that I wrote called Behind the Screen: Content Moderation in the Shadows of Social Media. This is the organizing principle of the book. Commercial content moderation, first and foremost, fundamentally, alpha and omega. What is it about? It's about brand management and liability mitigation for platforms who are maintaining a business-to-business relationship with their actual clients and customers, who are other corporate entities, advertisers, data miners, etc. That there are significant protections and effects now that are felt by users. Of course, I'm not arguing that that's not important, but I think we have to understand that was secondary, right? Because when the platforms that we're talking about came online, it was under the guise of free expression all the time, unmitigated, unmolested expression. We have to undo this mythology that we've been sold so that we can understand more plainly what's going on in the platforms. That was never true, and it never will be true. And I think once we get our heads around that actual organizing principle, we can unpack the logic that is driving a lot of these decisions and understand it better, and also respond to it accordingly.
Sure. Well, Sarah, I have a couple follow-up questions to that, though. Do you think part of the problem is that the media has kind of promoted this idea, especially around Twitter, that it's a quote-unquote public square, whereas in fact, a public square is now inside of a private company? Therein lies the rub. This would be more similar or akin to a mall, which has a kind of a quasi feel of a public square, and therefore legally is kind of viewed that way. I mean, I'm curious of what you think on that. Do you think that we're going to have to reimagine what this might be? And I'm thinking about the some of the work that's happening from New Public, formerly known as Civic Signals, run by Eli Pariser, is one of the co-founders, done some great work on filter bubbles, echo chambers. So a lot of people follow his lead. I mean, what do you think? Do you think we need more of a public type of social media, or where do you think we're headed with this issue?
Well, I certainly think we need a multifaceted response to, really what is a domination by very few players in the market. So, antitrust, it's not just, it ought not to be off the table. It has other kinds of impacts that go beyond the obvious of kind of market and financial monopoly. It has other effects that could potentially be brought to bear, but that's, again, one tool. I think market differentiation is a factor that's going to come along here. These platforms have long endeavored to be everything to everyone. That's actually a very tall order, and it's an ill fit in many cases. In terms of this idea of what constitutes a public square, a public space, I would argue that, I don't know that it's so much the media that carry the responsibility for that misconception. I think early on there wasn't enough skepticism from mainstream media around what the PR apparatus at a given platform was telling them. That has shifted, of course, and there's much more a kind of nuanced and sophisticated reporting around those issues. I think the guilty parties for kind of creating the mythology that these platforms are a public square are the companies themselves. And they did this, I think, in part because they believe their own rhetoric. So that is, a factor to take under consideration. But also because a cynic's view would say that that was the way to get people on board, right? I mean, what would you rather do? Hey, come into our walled garden where we have legalese that, would take a law degree to really suss out and figure out that you clicked on when you joined us. And by the way, we're monitoring your behavior. And by the way, if we don't like what you do, we're going to kick you out. Or come over here and emote freely. Which would you rather do, right? Like, which is more appealing? So I think, the public, in essence, was kind of lured in under false pretenses at a time when the functionality was where the light was shining, as opposed to the other issues at play. And, in the context of the United States, which is the one I know best, we have to look at the rise of these platforms as a quasi, as a faux public square or public sphere, I think would be a better term, to use a theoretical term, versus the decline, the gross decimation of public institutions in the United States. These are things that, we could show on a chart like this, right? So as we're destroying the public school system, as we're defunding public libraries, as we're losing, physical spaces for people to come and be in community, to debate, to collectivize, to do all the things that we do socially, as we lost those opportunities in our sort of civic life, these companies stepped in and lured us in because people want to be engaged. They want to debate. They want to be informed. But we have a problem when it's a handful of companies making opaque decisions for motivations that most people don't understand, kind of guarding the whole thing. And of course, as Murtaza said earlier, guess who's patrolling their own behavior? Guess who's guarding the hen house? They are. I mean, it's something we wouldn't accept in most other quarters. Let me put it that way.
But if you think about it too, and then I'll switch over to Murtaza, the very act of content moderation tends not to be a profit ad. I mean, profit ad in the sense that it could be a competitive advantage. But at the end of the day, like that 2018 Zuckerberg quote that most of us know, we sell ads. That's how we make money, right? So at the end of the day, because it's based more on an ad-based model, most social media platforms is free but not free, right? So it needs kind of attention. The very act of dealing with hate speech and moderation and nudity, things of that nature, is actually more of a kind of the opposite direction of scalability, the opposite direction of making more money. But Murtaza, I want to bring you in on the question of hate speech, a major topic that is incredibly important right now with the turmoil, not only in the United States, but across the globe, where we've seen authoritarianism, unfortunately, on the potential rise. So we do have a question about hate speech. What definitions are you using for hate speech and incitement of violence, right? So a big conversation. We also received some earlier questions talking about what about the offline versus online connection with violence, especially after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. So Murtaza, love to hear what you're using, especially with a human rights lens as well about hate speech.
Well, yeah, hate speech doesn't, as many people will tell you, that have an internationally agreed definition. The closest thing we have is the UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech, which actually defines hate speech quite similarly to how it's defined in the content policies of a number of social media companies, which is along the lines of a direct attack based on a number of protected characteristics. Where it differentiates between itself and the social media platforms, let's take Facebook, for example, is that the list of the grounds of protected characteristics are far more limited in the definitions of social media companies. For example, they don't include linguistic identity. Hate speech on the basis of immigration status is a hazy issue, and it's a closed list. It's not a non-exhaustive list. Under human rights law, the grounds are far more expansive, and they should be non-exhaustive, and they should really be based on any identity factor, which is how the UN strategy defines it. Now, in relation to offline and online hate speech, obviously this is to do with incitement to violence. And I think what happened with Trump is that showed that it was in terms of the when it when you ban someone for inciting violence when the violence has already been incited, the policy didn't work. The idea of implementing incitement to violence policy is to try to get in at the point where there is incitement. And the truth is, the social media companies, because of commercial pressures internally, PR pressures externally, and having no sort of transparency and accountability for implementation of their rules, are very apprehensive to implement these policies as they're supposed to be implemented. And I wouldn't just take the example of the Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook suspensions happening too late, i.e., after the violence had already occurred. I would take you back to George Floyd and what happened in that situation, where Twitter immediately reacted to what Trump had said, whereas Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, his immediate response was when he said, "When they will be looting, they will be shooting." He is referring to something relating to law enforcement. That's shooting people for looting isn't law enforcement.
Yeah.
And when the boycott happened, and when there was public, outcry, Facebook just, public.
Yeah. Well, I think, I want to kind of bring some of the conversation with that back to some of the earlier comments that Sarah mentioned, because I see a bunch of comments, so keep them coming. And then I also have a stack of cards from some of the earlier questions we received. I'd like to kind of point out, though, there certainly has been a major change in how we've even viewed this issue. A lot of people right now, especially with the new Biden administration, are going to be looking at Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act from 1996. Interestingly enough, though, that passed with bipartisan support, overwhelming support, whereas at that time in the mid to late 90s, the major concern was pornography, which is an exemption, especially around more problematic pornography, is an exemption to Section 230, anything dealing with kind of sexual exploitation as well. But it's also interesting to note, right after that happened, there was the Cyberspace Manifesto, very interesting document. If you look at it, where that was a manifesto saying, hey, laws don't apply here, that the web is kind of a no man's land for laws, that it's not and shouldn't be under U.S. jurisdiction. Whereas right now, if we're looking at 2021, there seems to be a major shift. We're seemingly saying we want more activism from our political leaders. So, Sarah, I'd love to have you kind of take that about where you see 2021 headed, whether you have any thoughts or insight of where the Biden administration might take it, because everybody is talking about Section 230, both Republicans and Democrats, for very different reasons. So they disagree on the reason, but they both are talking about revising it, or, Trump was talking about revoking it earlier as well.
Yeah, he was. Of course, the irony of Trump's utterances on that point is that Trump wouldn't have been Trump without Section 230 and social media allowing his ability to become what he became. So I think that one is hard pressed to know whether his statement was based on ignorance of that fact or cynicism around it. But either way, I think Trump's desire to revoke 230 would have been a disservice that would have not done him any good. So I think it's very interesting. A number of years ago, listen, some of my best friends are lawyers. Okay, I'll start out by saying that. But I came to loggerheads with some of them, even just a few years ago, where I said, look, the kind of the legal the legal principle that's at play here, that content moderation at the commercial level has been organized around, is this really this valve that is Section 230 that allows firms to dial it to their own preferred tension level, right? Where they can either choose to not act, they can choose to not do something about content and have no liability, or they can choose to act and remove content, likewise have no liability. Now, my lawyer friends back a few years ago were telling me that focusing on Section 230 was a non-starter because it was a U.S. statute that would soon, not be relevant if it even still were. But of course, it's relevant in the sense that that may be true, but there are other kinds of power structures at play here. The number one being the fact that these are firms that are in business. They're not John Perry Barlow's Grateful Dead-esque imagining of a cyberspace that's ethereal, disconnected from planet Earth, and also not in the business of making gross profit. Those are incompatible principles, I'm sorry to say. As a person who's been online since 1993, and I thought I missed the boat when I joined the internet in 1993 in its heyday, I was a Johnny-come-lately at that time. I can tell you there's been revolution after revolution in how the internet has become this commercial space. So with regard to Section 230, then, yes, it may be U.S. law. It may be applicable only in the U.S., but see, the firms are global. The firms have the power to do what they will do based on their best interest and their the legal mandates they're under, and also because that is a principle that's highly favorable to them. Who wouldn't want all of the reward and really not having any of the responsibility? I would love that setup myself, right? Where I can make any decision I want and really have no consequence, with a very small carve out that you mentioned for some of the most heinous kind of material that's illegal everywhere in the world anyway. So here's the latest kind of on 230 as it's finally coming into public consciousness. It's a thing, I always gauge this by, could I go to a cocktail party? Remember when we went to cocktail parties and had friends and got together? If I could go to a cocktail party and mention the thing and not get a blank stare, then I know it's kind of, made its way into public consciousness. Well, I think 230 is a thing that's now there. Yeah. It's finally kind of up for debate, right? In the kind of social sense in the United States, certainly in the governance sense. But at the same time that is becoming up for debate, what are the firms doing? The firms are taking Section 230 like language, packaging it up in trade agreements, international trade agreements that their lobbyists are lobbying Congress around, and they're exporting that around the globe to other places. That the most anti-democratic things out there are these trade agreements. They're secret. You can't, how do you vote on it? You don't. There's all kinds of money and other interests involved. So we're finally going to have the debate in the United States, but we're going to export this not only de facto, but now de jure around the world in the form of trade agreements. I mean, I almost fell out of my seat when I heard the counsel from Google kind of wink and nod at Congress when she was there talking about this issue at a hearing last year. So the last thing I'll say is that, of course, there's going to be robust debate with both Democrats and Republicans claiming harm under Section 230, claiming bias, claiming harm. Yes, that will be a very popular position. But the statistics don't bear that out. I mean, research shows that right-wing material online circulates at 5 times the level that that so-called leftist kinds of material would, or left-leaning. So I was eager to be called before Congress subcommittee to be asked, is there a bias towards in favor of the left and against the right on social media? And I was going to lean into the mic and say no, and then point at Donald Trump's account. Now he's been suspended, but again, as Murtaza said, I mean, incitement to violence, the violence, we're way beyond. So I think we have to watch very carefully as this debate unfolds in Congress, because there will be, of course, it will be political theater in large part, and there will be a lot of disingenuous statements made around what's actually going on. The bottom line is that the firms enjoy a freedom to act that their own industry peers are sick of, right? So you've got traditional broadcast media, you've got film studios, others who are subject to a host of rules, whether it's broadcasting regulations or other kinds of content regulations, who are saying, why do these guys get a free pass, right? And it may have been the case that at one time, content was just kind of circulating based on user-generated content solely. But these firms all have production studios. They're engaged in creating programming. They certainly game the system by using algorithms to put that stuff in front of us. So to claim that they're sort of like hands-free with regard to content and they're simply intermediaries, I mean, that is just bogus. And I think that's something that wherever you are in the political spectrum, you can agree with.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly seems like something we should point out, that even though social media has media in the name, it's not something that falls under the FCC. It's not labeled as a media company. Generally, for the reasons of a media company would filter and then publish, whereas based on user-generated content, you are publishing and then filtering through AI and human moderation. But Sarah, as you point out, a very interesting evolution with the rise of Netflix and everybody else being a content producer is that most of these, like Facebook, right, they even have their own produced shows that they have. But Murtaza, I want to bring you in because another hot conversation, and received a bunch of comments about some of the kind of alternative media. And if you look at platforms like Facebook and Twitter, they have their they're cousins, I guess you will, for alternative media. People right now are talking about Parler and Gab. I guess the conversation that comes into play here is, when we imagine this happening over the next couple of years, is it something where you think there will be a general universal standard of content moderation that is adopted kind of globally? Or is it going to be a different level, almost like a country to country? It's going to be a different level of moderation. So you might go to the highly Disney-fied type of moderation that you would have in, Facebook, and then you might have a more Wild West type of approach with Parler if they get back online. So Murtaza, love to hear your take on that of where social media is headed, whether it's going to be a general standard or if it's going to be a lot of different internet experiences, if you will.
I would say a general standard, a universal standard is a unicorn of sorts. It just won't be possible for a number of reasons. The main one being that it has to be implemented across a number of different state jurisdictions. Secondly, the major issue with content moderation concerns online harms, and a vast majority of those online harms are specific to the online context and are not criminalized. And I think this goes back to a lot of what Sarah was saying, which is that the key word here when we talk about social media content moderation is responsibility. How do we get them to be responsible? And I'm not an expert in section 230. But I would say that the issue isn't whether there should be an exemption from liability or not. The issue is that, can laws be crafted specifically for social media companies to hold them to account, or to make them responsible in an appropriate way, which does not engage normal criminal laws? And I think what you see in Europe, what you see in the European Commission with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, and what you see in the UK with regard to the forthcoming online harms bill, which will actually which will actually assign Ofcom, which is the broadcasting regulator, as the regulator for all online harms, are potential ways to move forward. And I would say, once again, going back to my original comment, we are still at the point of getting the online platforms to implement the policies which they say that they have. And the issue with that, and the regulation, the regulatory approach that's been taken in Europe and in the UK, is going to put forward the idea of procedural regulation. In that, it will force the platforms to be far more transparent and accountable in how they're implementing their own policies. But in the UK, for example, there is still that tension between what is harmful but legal and what is illegal and harmful. And that's still something that has not been resolved. And I raised with you before we started the discussion that even if smaller platforms like Gab or Parler, or even massively disruptive platforms like TikTok, which has taken a huge market share from YouTube and Facebook, all they need is a set of content policies to be, for example, Parler. All they need is to say, now we have some community guidelines, and they will be allowed back onto the Amazon hosting service, and they will be allowed back onto the app stores in Android and on Apple. There will be no check, there will be no accountability, there will be no transparency whether they actually implement that. And if they did do that, it would be a very clever way to come back online, and the same users will be using it and using the same sort of harmful speech that they were in the run-up to the storming of the Capitol.
Yeah, and we'll see where that's headed. So again, we might have to revisit this issue soon. But looking at the time, we have a time for one more question, and then I'm going to check back in with both of you to see any final thoughts, and then where people can stay in touch with you. But given how topical this topic is, I want to bring in Kieran's question. Do we have any ideas why extreme ideas circulate quicker? Is it the so-called outrage effect, right? So very, very topical, good question. We've seen a lot of problematic activity happening from the potential climate, right? The online climate, the overall information ecosystem. So Sarah, I'll start with you. Are these bad ideas, are they circulating quicker? Like can we remove certain people from platforms, and does that mean we're going to make a better information ecosystem and less white supremacists, less terrible ideas that can be that can incite violence?
It's a question worthy of a PhD dissertation. So, and certainly there are many underway that are taking that on. I think for the purposes of this conversation, I want to steer us back to the business model and to the extent to which the firms themselves and their products are involved in promoting material to the end of creating and keeping engagement. So the first thing I'll say is, one of the lines that you'll hear promulgated in industry is that social media is a mirror that is simply holding up a mirror to society and then, reflects back what exists in society. So to an extent, that's true in the sense that white supremacists online meet white supremacists offline. People, misogynists, people intolerant of others, ethno-nationalists, all of the things, those all exist in our world, and that is reflected online, of course. But I think the metaphor really is poor because it doesn't account for all the amplification effects that are going on and all the interests that are at play, again, financial primarily, which engage to do things like algorithmically boost content, put things in front of people's eyeballs. I mean, if you've ever endeavored to set up any timeline on any service you're on to simply just give you chronological postings of the people you follow, I wish you Godspeed, because it's almost impossible to do, right? You keep getting stuff served for other reasons to you. And so this idea of a mirror on society, I think a better metaphor is actually that it's more like a magnifying glass. And a magnifying glass can be used to kind of artificially give prominence to a particular facet of our society, right? And the other thing it can be used to do, quite frankly, is to, start a fire. Yeah. Right, you can use a magnifying glass to angle that light and start a fire.
And we're the insects that are getting burned on that. Yes,
that's right. And so I think to respond to the question, which is an important one, there are so many issues at play. But in terms of this conversation, what's relevant is unpacking the interests that are at play, which, I'll go back to what Murtaza has been saying this whole time, which is essentially that when we're in primary school and we're doing our math homework and we just turn a thing in with answers, what does the teacher write on the paper? Show your work.
Yeah, show your work.
Show your work, please. The public wants that. So of course, legally and in all these other ways, these companies they don't have to do it, right? At least at this point. But from a PR perspective, from a public trust perspective, from calls for civil society, from demonstrations where, we've seen the result be in the cost of human lives, right? Show your work. Show your work.
Yeah. Well, and unfortunately, to continue on this conversation, we could spend the next 7 days. There's so much material, and we received so many that we couldn't get to, but we will post that on our website, alltechishuman.org. We're also going to continue the conversation if you join us on our Slack group that we recently started. You can find that if you go to alltechishuman.org. You'll see that on the top of our website for that. I also like to thank our partner on this, TheBridge. Check them out at thebridgework.com, and then see our follow-up curated resources where you can find Sarah's book and other resources that were mentioned today through the Radical AI podcast that will be following in coming days and included in our newsletter. But I just want to hear from both of you about where we can stay in touch with your incredible work, especially since this is an issue that's not going away. So Murtaza, I'll start with you. Where can people stay in touch with the work that you're doing?
The work that the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues is doing, that can be found on the website of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. That's very easily Googleable, and the Special Rapporteur's name is Dr. Fernand de Varennes. So that's where the work can be followed. And on Twitter, my handle is Dr. Murtaza Sheikh.
Perfect. Well, and we really appreciate having you on. And then also, Sarah, where can people find you on? I know I follow you on Twitter, and you have some incredible spicy tweets. So you're a fun person to see, get into a lot of great conversations. So where can people follow along with your work, and then also where can they find your book as well?
Sure. First of all, for the less hot take version of the work, I would ask viewers and listeners to please follow the center, the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry on Twitter. The handle is C2I2_UCLA. There you will find links to many topics of the day and to the specific work of the center, of our partners at the center, and so forth. My own handle is at Ubiquity75. I cannot promise that there aren't some naughty words sometimes espoused on that Twitter, because I get agitated. But at the core, there's more of this that I'm talking about today, and other takes as well. So please, if you're up for it, follow me there. It's not for everyone, of course.
We should all follow you there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. As to the book, the book is Behind the Screen: Content Moderation in the Shadows of Social Media on Yale University Press, released in 2019. You can get it directly from Yale University Press. You can certainly get it from the big sellers online. You can also ask your local independent bookseller to carry the book or to order it for you, which they will happily do, and they would love your business at such a difficult time. So that's a great way to go as well. Just give them a call and they will be able to order the book for you that way.
Well, it's a great book to read, and then you were in early. A lot of people mentioned some of the work of Casey Newton. You were far ahead of that. It's always important to mention that we have people who have been actively working in this space for years and doing a lot of the foundational work that then later on gets caught by other media figures. So Dr. Sarah T. Roberts, Dr. Mataza Shaikh, thank you for coming on our conversation. I'm David Ryan Polgar with the organization All Tech is Human. Check us out at alltechishuman.org. Thank you, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.